20th Century Geek is part of Britpod Scene, a network of uniquely British podcasts that's always growing. Check out BritpodScene.com or follow Britpod Scene on Twitter to find out more.
I'm Scott Weatherly. Welcome to 20th Century Geek. Okay, so welcome listeners. For old listeners, welcome. And for new listeners, welcome to the party. We're doing something a bit different for August. I've usually do a fortnightly podcast, but being the summer holidays, I thought I'd do something a little different, trying to do one a week. And more than that, I'm doing co-hoster's choice. So you're probably going to hear some familiar voices. I've got my friend Mike, Kim, the guys from Super Shakes are coming on, and every topic we're going to cover is going to be their choice. But I'm kicking off with something a little bit special this month. So August is kicking off with something from across the pond, and I'm going to introduce Orie from a company called DragonFruit. Hello Orie, how you doing?
Me. I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you for coming on. It's fantastic. Do you want to introduce yourself and DragonFruit?
Sure, absolutely. So I am Orie. Hello. Calling you all the way from New York City, which is far less exciting than it sounds. And I founded DragonFruit a couple years back now. We are the free dating app for geeks. And our goal really is to create a community of like-minded people and get people chatting to each other in their areas and around the world, and hopefully have some sparks fly and see if we can't make a few people happy on the way. The idea behind it essentially is, first of all, there's a massive gap where, for some reason, the internet, despite having been invented by and largely controlled by geeks, didn't really have any dating service app, whatever you want to call it, especially for us. And so we decided to sort of move into that space and think about what it is that geeks actually care about. And we developed a pretty cool matching engine that takes into account all kinds of things about you, but most importantly, the things that you're into, which is very helpful to, get the conversation going and make sure that you have at least something in common before you really, dive into it. And it just kind of removes all the awkwardness, knowing that you're speaking to like-minded people. And so, yeah, I highly recommend you checking it out. You can find us available for free, as I said, on the iOS App Store and on Google Play, and also a web version at dragonfruitapp.com. Okay,
I should say I had a look at it. I googled it and had a look at it and all sort of thing. So I had to have a conversation with my wife beforehand, just to explain why I was looking at a dating app for geeks. But it's good. It's a really sort of quite intuitive piece of kit. It's a good website. It's a good app, and it's honestly, in several conversations I've had since you and I first had our conversation of the week, I know at least 3 people that have sort of gone, really? Oh, so what's it called? So you've probably got 3 more accounts at least from that. So it's a fantastic idea.
Cheers. Yeah, most people look at me askance and go, "Damn you! I should have thought of that."
It's so true. I can't believe it didn't exist. Yeah. And
yeah, well, one of the things that we were trying to do is sort of create a much more honest experience. I'll fess up here and say that there have been geek dating. If you Google just those words, you will find other things on the internet. But I my idea came independently of that, but there's nothing new under the sun. But what we were trying to do really is to be as tailored as possible to the geek experience. And when I was doing my sort of opposition research to see what else was out there and whether there was any room for me to maneuver in the market, I found that the vast majority of things that that bill themselves as geek dating is just sort of a skin mounted onto some pre-packaged software that they stick the word geek on it and there's nothing really else to it. So really we designed the whole thing from scratch, from the bottom up, and the question in the forefront of our minds was always, all right, how do we make this reflect our experience? By we, I mean me and my extremely geeky friends. And how can we, what would we want out of it if this is, because there are so many terribly annoying things on the internet, and we were like, all right, here's a list of things that we absolutely will not abide. And so that's kind of where that was our design ethos, that, and to be as easy as possible to use, which hopefully we've achieved. But it was just, try to do it right.
Yeah. And
that's the hope.
Well, it's that thing, like I say, it's by geeks for geeks, really.
Absolutely, that's our tagline.
Yeah, so it's it's perfect. It works really well. I do think it will hopefully help. It's funny because I know I've been to a number of like conventions and other things, geek related and nerd related, and the amount of times you go and you sort of you see the awkwardness of people meeting and those first couple of conversations are what people are into and that sort of thing. And even within like the geek community, it can be a bit of a minefield.
It absolutely can. And I think, well, two things about that. The first, one of the things that really made me believe that this idea could be a success is from going to conventions and having all of my expectations just completely blown away. I was so pleased and so surprised to find that everybody I was meeting, and I was meeting so many people, just chatting and sort of, your costume's amazing and whatever, were these intelligent, friendly, gregarious, talented people who, were so much more normal than a lifetime of negative stereotyping had led me to believe, right? I wasn't involved in any kind of community when I was growing up. I grew up sort of between the UK and Switzerland, which is why I sound a bit odd. And there was no real outlet for me and my geekiness. So I did it all sort of on my own, in my corner, my family would, we would watch Star Trek together and things like that. And I had always derived some kind of sense of shame from it, because that's kind of how our culture has treated geekiness as as a lifestyle. And so when I was in the States and I started my very first convention, I was like, oh God, I've seen this on TV. I know exactly what to expect. This is going to be wretched. And I suddenly discovered that there is actually a community out there that's brilliant. And that has been my experience ever since. It was just my own sort of self-imposed isolation that meant that I never really had a chance to observe anything other than what was being shoved down my throat by television and films, from the 80s and 90s. So when I saw that, and when I made all of these friends and they were still complaining about how hard it is to talk to people and how, they've been single for how long, I'm like, how is that possible? You're attractive and clever and funny and kind, and and you're all here together and you're talking to one another and you're having exactly the same complaints that I would have had before I knew any of this existed. And so that really convinced me that this was a need in the community, and that, if you put somebody in a context where the intention is to get to know people, that things would just start to run and flow on their own.
Yeah, it is. It's like, light the touch paper and see what happens. I think that gives someone the opportunity to do that, and they will. But it can, give them the platform to do it. Great, but force them to do it. It can be a bit difficult. I mean, everything you've just said echoes my own experience of being interested in, all these different things from, let's say, Star Trek, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and everything else on, in that area in the 90s and the 80s. Comics and everything, and my parents and even certain friends been like, really, do you not, which football team do you support? And I'm like, well, none really. And they're like, oh, and you feel an out, you sort of impose your own exile, don't you? And then I have to admit, it's only been really in the last sort of 10 years that I've been able to find that community, that sort of, that you go up to people, and I've been to cons on my own. And you'll be stood in a queue, and you'll sort of get your copy out of whatever because you're getting that signed, or you're going to see something else, and someone else will go, oh, yeah, that's brilliant, that is. And you'll spend half an hour having a conversation with someone, and you just go, well, that was pleasant, that was fantastic. I wasn't expecting that. That was... So, yeah, it is. It's a fantastic community. So I think this is brilliant. I think this is exactly what it needs, and it'll be... I hope it takes off in the best possible way.
Yeah, well, you and me both.
Yeah. So... Then let's take our geekiness into the next step. Really, the topic we're going to cover, really, in a roundabout way. I tried to think about if I could give it a title, but we sort of had a conversation like this the other day. Really, this whole podcast is 20th Century Geek is about pop culture and its origins in the 20th century, and we discussed around different things. And the one thing we started really talking about and got into and sort of had to stop ourselves a bit was actually the end of the 20th century.
Yeah, I confess, I shamefacedly admit to the fact that I am a bit of a 21st century boy, being the tender age of only 28. It means that most of my childhood was really defined by the 2000s. But that said, obviously, my parents and my elder siblings and everything were very 80s and 90s focused. I would watch Star Trek with my dad and everything. And one of the things that really fascinates me is the transitions that happen in popular culture that in some ways can inform sort of like a historical perspective. We always have secondary sources to try to figure out what was going on, and looking at culture as a reflection of history. And so obviously like I said, my experience is of the transitional years between the 20th century and the 21st. And really, there was some very interesting changes going on around there, and what we were talking about essentially, and what I imagine we're going to go into in just a second, is where the 20th century culturally ended and where the 21st began. And I think my conclusion is that those two things did not in any way happen simultaneously, and they certainly didn't happen on the 1st of January the year 2000.
No. Yeah, I always find that quite interesting. And sort of, like you said, there's calendar decades, and then there's clearly like pop culture decades, and there's always hangovers of the 80s clearly bled into the 90s, and then like I said the 90s clearly bled into the 2000s.
Yeah. One of the things that I love, I really enjoy on, when I don't need to pay too much attention when I'm cleaning around the house or something, is to put on some very, very old, I say very old, 60s and 70s British sitcoms, Dad's Army and Are You Being Served and all of those, the classics.
Yeah.
And I love the shock on the face of my American friends when they see how, the majority of it was in black and white, and it was all so basic, and to them it seems as if the 70s didn't make it to England.
Yeah.
Until far later. I'm looking at a sitcom that was filmed in like 1973, and I think to myself, this was a year before Star Wars. Why is this in black and white?
That's it. Yeah, I think in Britain, if you to ask sort of Americans, I think that for Britain, it's the 50s extended from 1950 to like 1984. I think it's yeah. But I also think there's an interesting thing in that sense. When I go back and I watch a lot of those. I love like Porridge and some of the really good 70s ones. But there's a couple that stand out that like just don't work anymore. You know what I mean? There's for many reasons. But there's one called
Carry On.
Oh god, the Carry On. I will be covering those at some point because I've got friends who keep asking, "Oh, you're going to do them?" I will.
Oof.
But have you ever seen a program called "Till Death Do Us Part" with Alf Garnett?
No, I never did.
So the idea is, it's basically there was a re-sort of do called One Foot in the Grave much later with a character called Victor Meldrew. But it's basically this grumpy, racist, bigoted old man from the sort of 60s and 70s. And it's on YouTube. Like, you can't get it.
Do you know what? I think I actually saw a clip from it the other day.
Yeah.
It was just like a racist tirade with the title being like, "This has not aged well."
Yeah.
Or something. It's like the dad is sitting there going, "Oh well, what's wrong with the world these days? I don't know why I'm doing a Yorkshire accent. That's probably not fair." But
it is. Yeah. It is. Well, because I watched it recently. Like the BBC have almost like disowned it to an extent. Like you can't get it on DVD, I don't think, or that sort of thing. But if you find it on YouTube, just Google or YouTube Alf Garnett or Till Death Do Us Part. Some of the stuff in that, like some of the black facing and some of the language and some of the names, derogatory names used. It's yeah.
See, I don't know if we should let them off the hook by saying it was a different time, because I mean, post-war, you couldn't really look at bold-faced racism and say that it was harmless.
No.
It was so fresh in everybody's minds, and as the 50s and 60s wore on, the horrors of the Holocaust, not to bring the podcast down or anything, but they were very recent, and to think that, it's all right, it's not as if anything bad could ever happen from injecting this into the culture. It seems, I don't know, naive.
Well, it was. The thing is, what's really funny about it is the character of Alf Garnett was the brunt of the jokes. He was like the Homer Simpson of the show. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the time, so he had like a son-in-law that was very art in the 70s episodes. He has a son-in-law that's like very very 70s. Flares, long hair, sideburns, all that kind of stuff. And throughout it, like he refers to him just basically as Pufter. And you're thinking, but so he's the brunt of the joke because they're all like, "Oh my god, how bigoted and old-fashioned is he?" That sort of thing. The times are changing. And then in that episode, there's an episode where he gets on a train and he gets in a cabin with an Asian gentleman, this Asian guy, and sort of like there's a really awkward moment. Unfortunately, because again, he is the brunt of the joke, or his casual racism isn't acceptable, and sort of thing. But for the show, the irony is, the Asian gentleman is played by Spike Milligan, a tall, white comedian in blackface.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that's
I think almost every comedy I can think of, and I could probably come up with half a dozen examples off the top of my head. Almost every comedy that I can think of is written with two completely separate audiences in mind. There's the audience that sees the satire and appreciates the irony and the sarcasm in it, and then there's the one who don't see that and agree with all of it and think it's bloody hilarious. And I don't think that this sort of thing was any exception. They knew who they were playing to. The enlightened and the unenlightened alike were enjoying it for completely different reasons.
It's true. It is. I wonder whether, if you were to sort of re-air that on BBC Two or some of the BBC channels, if there wouldn't just be a massive uproar these days. Because I think again, like you say, some people wouldn't see past the joke to see the satire, and then would would be an uproar about the way the language and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's a fine line.
Yeah. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying go and get back into geekdom. And I have to say, I do love the sitcoms, especially of that era. So for a 21st century geek, what's your jam then? So what was the 21st century things then that to see how they're different?
Well, okay. Well, the things that I loved. I mean, I'm a sci-fi guy through and through. I grew up with Star Trek, and later on, I think in university, I was watching Battlestar Galactica as it came out, and I have always loved science fiction for its ability to decontextualize current issues and treat them in isolation. There's something going on, and a lot of the time what science fiction likes to do is to write parables that are, and if it's badly written, then it's completely transparent, and it shows more like an episode of The West Wing than anything else.
Yeah.
But which, by the way, is a brilliant show. But really good sci-fi is always going to be based around these thought experiments that that make you think, that force you to consider this or that, and how it would apply to to issues today. And I think that the 21st century was a heyday for a lot of issues to come to the forefront, because I think that what to me defines the 21st century, at least as far as we have gone, is a more serious approach to things than before. I think we stopped having as much fun as we did previously, and I can sort of go into my watershed theory, but I think in the 21st century we kind of there was a sense in at least a little bit of Hollywood and the television industry that there was a responsibility of the producers and of the showrunners to try to challenge the audience and be active in global affairs in some way. So if I sort of go back to the original question, right? When did the 20th century end for most people culturally? And this doesn't necessarily mean in popular culture, because I think that popular culture lags behind the world by about 5 or 10 years, because it takes the makers of it a while to get up to speed, and I'm sure we can talk about that plenty. But the 20th century, I think, what with it being dominated by global warfare, ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and then in 91 when the Soviet Union dissolved. There was this sense. I get this from my mother. Okay, she has often turned to me and said, "God, what has happened to the world? We all thought in the 90s that everything would be fine.
Yeah. And
everything had finished. The world wars were over. The Cold War was over. The Yugoslav wars. When were they? I think they might have been later. I forget whether she uses that as the example of how everything went to pot again. And she sort of cites this time, this period in history. Yeah, it was at the end of the 90s that I mean at the beginning of the 90s. So there was this time in between 98 and 91 where the world just seemed at peace. Do Do you know, it's
It was a period of unity.
It really was. I mean, the European project was, getting underway properly. People were talking about the unified markets.
Yeah.
There was less war in Africa. There was, America and Russia had called it quits and everything. And there was just this sense that we'd finally gotten on track. We're on our way to utopia. And I think that is reflected very much in the media of the time. So, prior to that, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was very, very clear what was happening. There was Hollywood, which was a branch of the propaganda arm of the US government, or, Western civilization as represented in art. And we always knew, there were so many films over and over again where the enemy was clear and all we needed was a hero to rally behind. And there are so many heroes' tales, the, archetypal story structure, and a very clear good guy and a very clear bad guy. And that was a necessary element during that time when there was so much uncertainty, particularly what with the hippie movement undermining that kind of narrative, where people were like, these wars have been going on long enough and nobody even remembers what we're fighting for.
Well, just to intercut there, I mean, you make a really good point, and the thing I would say is to represent that in almost like a physical sense. In the 80s, the thing I always think about for the 80s in that sense is the shift, especially in action movies, to almost like that physical representation of what is America. So you have John Rambo, you have Rocky, you have all the characters that Arnie plays, or Dolph Lundgren or Jean-Claude Van Damme. The action movies of the 80s were the one-man army. It was that really hulking guy that could take on an enemy, and like you say, it was a defined enemy, usually Russian.
Yeah, usually Russian. And I think that a little bit later on, towards the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a sense that those kind of stories just didn't really fly anymore because we couldn't relate as much to them. The Russian menace had more or less disappeared, and Hollywood for a while kind of scrambled to try to find other easily categorized enemies. James Bond, after GoldenEye, ended up fighting the North Koreans in, what was it, Die Another Day?
Yes. Which
was frankly terrible. And I think there was a lot of that where people were sort of scrambling to figure out how to write things that people will care enough about to go out and pay a film ticket. And we ended up with some really interesting films and some really interesting franchises that were oddly introspective, that were about moral conflict and the role of war in society and things like that. As maligned as they are, the prequel trilogy of Star Wars is pretty much a prime example of that. They, released in 1999 was the first one. Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And the whole thing was politics. All three films. Sure, you have, the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker, but the whole thing, and what most people really hated about it, because it was very, very different from the original trilogy, was that it was about trade disputes and politics and the machinations of power and the undermining of democracy, and that's the kind of sort of post-Reaganite way of thinking of the preceding decade, where war was less of a threat, and so we started looking, instead of for an external enemy, for an enemy within.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think the 90s are replete with it. I think the 90s, that thing, like the Berlin Wall comes down, Russia is no longer an enemy, and I think America in particularly, you get that you said that period of unity, that period of peace, and then all of a sudden, and if I have any American listeners, please don't take this the wrong way, but it's a country that sort of like it likes to have an enemy, So when the population and when the media machine starts turning on its own government, I mean, I just looked. Oliver Stone's JFK was 1991.
Oh yeah.
You then get other similar things going on, but then you get like the X-Files and other shows like that start turning on the American government and saying, well, yeah, the Cold War's over, but look at the government. Look at all the naughty and dodgy things they've been up to for all these years.
Yeah.
When
was Conspiracy Theory?
I should have a look. The Mel Gibson film.
Yes.
Oh, definitely in the 90s. I will check.
97.
There you go.
1997. Yeah, and you know what? I don't think we even need to look at such. I mean, Conspiracy Theory again wasn't a particularly good film. It's a bit niche there, and I imagine there are a lot of people who haven't seen JFK. But the things that people did really invest in are the things that got going at that time. Things like, as you said, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where not only are there about 3 seasons dedicated almost exclusively to a shadowy government organization, messing things up and being irresponsible, but the very concept of vampires in fiction is that they look like us, they trick us, they are us. When you're turned, you have the face of of a friend. It's very difficult to tell who is good and who is bad, and that is, I think, quite telling that was about the time when the whole sort of vampire mania really got going. But even more than that, and I love Buffy and I love Angel and anything to do with the Joss Whedon sort of universe. I think that possibly a little bit prematurely, I'm sort of transitioning into the next bit, the beginning of the 21st century, which, spoilers ahead, I believe, and I don't think it's a particularly controversial statement to say that the 21st century really got started at 9/11.
Yeah.
The tone of everything just changed very, very quickly. The latter seasons of Buffy are very different from the earlier ones. Everything got a lot darker, a lot more sinister, and it was a very unusual change. And I think that there was a bit of a split there, but there was certainly, a watershed moment in 2001 when things changed again. So like I don't really know into what category 89 to 01 really falls into. It's a bit sort of interwar, but it's a very interesting period of introspection, I think.
Yeah, well, I honestly think there's a period. You mentioned James Bond, and I think Bond's a really good example of following that. That you had the Timothy Dalton Bond, which I think is massively underrated, and you get the Pierce Brosnan, and straight away in GoldenEye, which is like first post Cold War Bond, that you get Judi Dench's M referring to him as a dinosaur relic of the Cold War. So they're acknowledging it straight off the bat. And then you get this sort of series of Bond films throughout the 90s where they just not really sure what to do with him. I like GoldenEye because it works as a post-Cold War spy film.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, the villains, or like you say, they go to the Koreans and they go to other things and they have to make things up. But there's always
I believe the enemy in one of them was oil.
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
Literally oil.
and then they actually have a media mogul as well, and in one of them, which I think is like I said, there's World's Not Enough, Tomorrow Never Dies, and that I like Pierce Brosnan as Bond, but I think they are some of the worst, most meandering Bond films because they're never sure who the enemy should be.
If it weren't for the utter brilliance of GoldenEye, I think that the whole Pierce Brosnan tenure would be seen a lot less kindly.
Yes, I totally agree. And then you said, so he stops his, that sort of period ends, and then the post, but they're all bombastic. I mean, they still hold that thing, and they're all looking for an enemy. and then you have 9/11, and all of a sudden you get smaller, sort of more gritty spy films like the Jason Bourne trilogy, and even to this day, you've actually had a successful Tinker Tailor Soldier spy film where there's a much harder look at intelligence agencies. Nothing. There was a program. In fact, I'm going to check it out. There was a British program. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it, called Spooks.
Yes, I remember Spooks. God, that was good.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It was a great show. I haven't seen it for a long time. I watched the film version of it not too long ago, which is quite good. Here you go. So it started in 2002. So it started on BBC One in 2002, and that was again. It's about. It's that thing of, it's not bombastic. It's not one man spy going off to take on the whole enemy. It's all about the intelligence gathering and the sort of the more gritty sort of thing. And I think post 9/11, there was almost I almost want to say a guilt at, we've been doing this for years. The sort of like the one man army thing for so long, and then this happens. It's almost like we've got to support our troops, but we need to show the truth. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that the war in Afghanistan was largely popular. So there was a couple of years between 2001 and 2004 where things did a little bit go back to basics, and I think that Bond is a really good example of how it lags a little bit behind, because there was a discomfort with this that happened, particularly when the Iraq War started, and sort of the media and everybody else realized that it wasn't a particularly popular thing to be happening, right? There was extremely divided opinion on whether there should be a war in Iraq at all. And that, in 2005, was when we got Daniel Craig. So during the Pierce Brosnan years, I think that the Broccolis were holding on to a more classic interpretation of James Bond, the formula that had been working for them for, nigh on 30, 40 years, God knows. And then they caught up with it, and the Daniel Craig tenure has been it's a very different tone, unquestionably. And even you don't. Look at Batman, right?
I was just looking at Batman, 2005.
2005. We went from Oh no, we didn't. No, I'm completely right. I was going to say Michael Keaton. We had Val Kilmer and George Clooney in between, but they were all silly and fun,
yes,
and so impossibly 90s that it was. It's iconically so. You don't need to look any further than Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze to see what the 90s were about.
Yeah.
It was when we were just being silly, we were having fun. And then the Nolan trilogy, part of it, a very big story point, I believe, in Dark Knight, was about electronic surveillance.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was a real moral quandary, right? They stand there and they say, "Oh, I've turned every cell phone in the city into a sonar device, and I can see everything that happens." I'm like, and there is a real moral dilemma that happens, and Morgan Freeman says, nobody should have this kind of power. Note, this is years before, the PRISM revelations and Edward Snowden and all of that.
Well, I think really weird. Look at the Nolan trilogy in the retrospect. It's one of those things where if you look at them as films, yes, you can critique them and that sort of thing. They've all got faults, but they're all brilliant. I really enjoyed the trilogy. But you're right. 2005, we get a much grittier, realistic take on the Batman. Batman Begins, and it is clearly a representation of one man can make a difference. It's that thing of being a symbol of hope. How can you be a symbol of hope in this era? And then you get this sort of the Dark Knight again. Sort of they all touch into some sort of some sort of cultural touchstone. The Dark Knight is at the end of it. Like you say, it's that thing about surveillance, but also about the Joker representing that sort of the ease with which a population will turn on itself. You know, why so serious? It's almost like he's almost asking the question of everybody: why so serious? Well, this was bound to happen. This is your own fault.
Yeah.
And then, like I say, you get to the Dark Knight Rises, and it's almost about the 1%ers. You know, it's Bane leading the people, or that the rest against the rich, and sort of bringing Gotham to its knees and this other stuff, and Batman being the ultimate 1%er.
Bane as Bernie Sanders. Interesting. Oh, I'm sure somebody has YouTubed that before.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, I mean, you're definitely right. I think the things that I focus on, as I said before, was science fiction and how that was developing during the time. And in the Next Generation, Star Trek, as if I have to specify. No, the Next Generation, Degrassi, was started in 1987, and I think that as usual, you know, most science fiction is a little bit ahead of the curve, and they were trying to, you know, preach utopia, and there were some interesting storylines and everything like that. But the best moments of Next Gen were in that sort of interwar period of self-reflection and the freedom, the space to really think deeply about how we do things and what we've learned from the previous decades. But then when 2001 came along, we were, you know, in the midst of Deep Space Nine and then later Enterprise, and the tone from later DS9 versus early TNG is so completely different. And my absolute favorite, you know, yell at me all you like, listeners, my favorite Star Trek is Deep Space Nine. I think that the narrative, the broad story arcs in the later seasons of the Dominion Wars and all of that was so fascinating and so, I mean, it really delved into the realities of war and how, you know, intelligence gathering and the moral quandaries that come up, you know, how much of our soul are we willing to sacrifice in order to win for the greater good, etc. You know, it was so much of that, and I really appreciated it, that all that was happening. And that bled straight into the 2004 Battlestar Galactica, and that was as post 9/11 as it gets.
Yes.
I mean,
yeah.
It starts off with the eradication of civilization. That's not really a spoiler. It happens in the first 15 minutes. And what we as humans have to, you know, how we deal with that, how we deal with an attack, how we deal with a war that is invisible, how we deal with existential threats and the enemy within, and, you know, the suspension of, you know, what the questions that arise when people are desperate, not just to survive, but also to maintain their humanity, right? One of the most interesting episodes I thought was the one that revolved around reproductive rights. When there are so few humans left, how do we feel about birth control? That is a really freaking good question.
Yeah.
Right? And it challenged our all of our opinions, I think. It pushed progressivism to its breaking point with asking those kinds of questions, being like, all right, when push comes to shove and when it really, really matters, what side, like, where do you stand? Where will you stand? And that is, I think, you know, extremely representative of the kind of media we had in the 21st century. Once people had gotten used to the idea of, okay, there is war, we turned in on ourselves in a way that I don't think was really very common in the 20th century, when everything was very clear cut.
I think, yeah, no, I do, and I think it's bizarre. I think I actually think there's something interesting happening. I would say from about 2008-ish to now, based on what you're saying. during the Second World War, there's a reason that superheroes dominated the comic industry from the 40s onwards, and why certain superheroes sort of dominated. And a big part of that actually is the Second World War. So it acted as escapism. It's sort of all these other things, but you have superhuman or big, larger than life characters taking on an enemy. So you will actually have the famous picture of Captain America punching Hitler, or the picture of Superman with the eagle on his arm whilst he's waving the American flag, or so on and so forth. There's all these images and all these things, and that's why they made it big, and that's why the comics industry sort of grew out. Superheroes really took off. By let's say the first part of the 21st century, we had several things happen. We had, like I say, you had 9/11, which resulted in, I think, this sort of this reflection and respect, turning inwards to look at ourselves. We should get the more gritty, realistic approach to things, and we get some fantastic television out of it and some great movies. And then we go to war, and for a large period of time, we are at war, and it's almost like we have a moral crusade, much like the start of the First World War. The Second World War. It starts to turn, and excuse my phrasing for this, it may be a little inappropriate, but it all turns a little bit Vietnam later on.
Absolutely. 2004, 2005. The level of protest against the war was extremely reminiscent of 67 to 69.
And that's when you start to get, I'm thinking about, you get things like, you get a real mix. And I think, like, you say you've got the Batman trilogy, you get Battlestar Galactica, Bond, taking a different tranche. Several years later, people's war weariness and desire to escape from that, and you get Iron Man in 2008, and all of a sudden, you get back to colourful, clear-cut, well, relatively clear-cut, superheroes against pretty clear-cut bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that thing of, like, I see enough complicated politics and craziness on the news and in real life. I need something I can support. And I really think that's one of the bigger reasons why the MCU and everything has taken off.
It's pure escapism.
Yeah.
Well, even there, I think we can see a little bit of this. I really like, you look at the Avengers films, and in the first Avengers movie, I'm not gonna, there are too many of them to count, so I'll go for the big ones, right? The Avengers, the first one, not Captain America, but the Avengers, they were fighting aliens. Aliensaries. This is an easy narrative. We know who to support. They were very, very ugly, and everybody else was very pretty, and we had a lovely big fight scene at the end, and it was awesome.
Yeah.
The second Avengers film was fighting against our own creation. Ultron was a consequence of the previous war, right? He was so that's dealing with consequences, and I think that there was a lot of that in the second film in terms of how they were dealing with civilian casualties and all of that. And now we've had Captain America: Civil War, where the enemy is ourselves in the most literal sense. The team is split apart because they don't agree on the morality of the way in which they fight and save the world. And just seeing that progression from clear enemy, consequences, and internal conflict, I think shows really where we are as time goes by. And it's indicative, I think, very much of how the public reacts to a long drawn out war.
Yeah.
No matter what war that may be, it goes from, all right, we're doing this. It's our duty to support our troops, to support our country, whether or not we like it. We need to acknowledge that it's happening and be on the side of right. Followed by how sure are we that our methods, that our approach isn't going to have extremely negative consequences. And then finally we get into this war weariness where it kind of all devolves into infighting, where nobody can decide how any of it is going to end. Because of course, I mean, the good old days of warfare in the early 20th century, where there was a clear end and beginning to things, is long behind us. And war has changed so radically in the last 50 years that most of the time you don't, there hasn't been a formal declaration of war made in decades. And so we never know where things end, and we never know what the exit strategy is, and it's all very confused and confusing, and I think we see that really clearly.
It's funny you say that analogy. There's an old guy at work, and he had a really great analogy for how he sees. We were talking about the war in the Middle East and that sort of thing, and he says he remembers the first Gulf War and and earlier than that, like the Falklands and those sorts of things, and like how there was a very clear-cut structure to it. Like you say, there was a declaration of war, troops turned up, they had a fight until someone agreed, someone surrendered or they gave up or whatever, and then there was an agreement to peace, and then there was the peace talks afterwards. He says at the moment, it's a little bit like kids playing football in the park. He says people all turn up, it's a rabble, and then people sort of drop off, and the last one to leave takes the ball home, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, it's there used to be goals.
Yeah.
In the first Gulf War, we knew that there was an invasion of Kuwait. Kuwait needed to be not invaded, and once it wasn't invaded anymore, that was the end of it. Falklands was a simple fight over territory, and that resolved, and that was the end of that. And that's usually been the format. As crass as this is, get ready for it, guys.
I'm bracing.
It feels like we're in the middle of a marathon game of Cards Against Humanity.
Yeah.
There's no end. We just keep going, and everybody gets more and more horrible.
Yeah.
And the only time when something kind of ends, when does the game end? It's when everybody kind of agrees that we're really sick of this by now.
Yeah, the beer's gone, and I'm tired, and I want to go home. Yeah.
Oh, this is so much more of a grim conversation than I thought it would be.
But it's true, and the thing is, like I say, but when you look at that in especially if you're looking sort of like what's popular now, that thing of sort of like ongoing, almost unending bleakness, as you say. You've got things like The Walking Dead, and I'd even say like Game of Thrones, because it's just like, really, yes, I know there's going to be an ending and that sort of thing, but the machinations and the sort of game playing and backstabbing, and that could go on and on and on and on for generations, and it could be just as good television. But there is no real end to those sorts of things. They just go on.
Well, actually, I think there is an end to it. You look at it all and you say, okay, as entertaining as this is, the White Walkers are coming and nobody's paying attention. There is an end, and every single one of you will die. There's no point to any of it. So as much fun as we're having watching you guys stab each other in the back, there's no point to any of it.
So does that mean, okay, because what I'm thinking now is, right, you say that, and you talked about, we mentioned Civil War before, and we're going to get Infinity War next year. And again, the point of that clearly is going to be, here is this intergalactic being that can destroy us all. So let's forget our petty differences and take on this. Are we
Sounds about right.
Yeah, are we suggesting then that really we need a bigger, badder enemy? Is this the Watchmen ending?
I don't know.
I mean, to be fair, it made me think. Recently there was a thing in the news. I don't know if it's been changed since, but the Doomsday Clock got notched up a minute, I think.
Okay. Oh dear.
It was about 2 or 3 months ago, but there was no, as you know, the news never reports good news. So if it went back to sort of like better, they don't report on that. But the Doomsday Clock went up a minute, and it did. I did have that sort of that Watchmen moment where I was a bit like, at what point does anyone decide this is actually all very silly and there's better things to be doing?
I I don't know. I think there's been a bit of a shift. These days, the things that are being produced feel a little bit more directly post 9/11. The patriotism and sort of jingoism of rallying together, because for the last decade or so, the enemy, in quotes, has been so amorphous and difficult to identify, and we've had now 2 or 3 years of IS out there in the world, and they are so cartoonishly evil.
Yeah. Yes.
That it's unambiguous. Any right-thinking person is going to say these people are awful, and that's something we can all get behind. And so I think that ought to be a flashpoint for a rallying point, for the world. And yet, if life reflected fiction, we still seem to be involved in all kinds of petty squabbles, and by now I think media is getting pretty damn aspirational, just hoping that, the... do you know what I mean?
I do. I agree. I think it's when you talk of ISIS or and as a villain, it's and again I think for want of, I wish my vocabulary or my understanding was better, but there always needs to be the new Nazi, that villain, that enemy to focus on, that like you say, and it's true that there needs to be a unifying force with which to fight against, and until there are no enemies, and then what do you do? But yeah, I can feel it. In modern media, it's or modern pop culture, we do feel a little bit behind, maybe in that respect, because are we still focused on post 9/11? Are we waiting for that next event to sort of turn us again?
I don't know. I think that things have gotten a little bit too bleak, even for the media.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the things that have really made an impact in the last few years, what we get is an endless supply of nostalgia. Right? So in Game of Thrones, we have good old-fashioned fantasy. That's always been around, and you can always have it. But it's been shows like Mad Men that harken back to the early 60s, and we've had Peaky Blinders, and we've had just show after show after show, film after film, that have been set. I mean, period pieces are nothing new, but the popularity and the scope of some of the things we've seen lately really does seem like a way of escaping, because even the silly battles in superhero films are just a little too real.
Yeah, they're getting there. Yeah. Well, it's weird you say about fantasy and stuff, because I think fantasy is sort of like seeping into that sort of to other shows, in the sense of, let's say Game of Thrones is gritty and gruesome and that thing, but there's been 2 shows that have been on this year or recently that highlight to me that, because you're getting the good quality TV shows, but they're so like crazy off the wall that they're almost, you can sort of say, do they have a message or whatever? But the first one is Preacher.
Haven't watched it.
And the second one is the American Gods TV show based on the new game of Marvel. And they say about nostalgia. They say Game of American Gods is very much about the old versus the new. But it's done in such a way that it's all set within this world that really politics has got nothing to do with it. It's not about old. It is sort of like, well, old is better. But then there's this idea of like, yeah, but you've got to adapt. So it's not saying that, well, old is better or new is better. It's like, no, you've just got to adapt. That's how it works. Times change, so get on with it. But it's a great show. And the same with Preacher. Preacher's it's got its own messages about family and faith and all this other stuff. But it's batshit crazy and it's brilliant.
I haven't seen it. I guess I'll have to.
It's well worth the watch. It's crazy, but it's very, very good.
I'll admit that I read American Gods and didn't enjoy it very much, so I haven't watched the show, but I've heard good things.
Mm. So really, let's just do an overview then of sort of 2000, or let's do to now, 17 years in your pop culture history.
Mm-hmm.
What are the sort of the high points then for you? What are the things that really stand out for you then in that period?
I mean, Battlestar Galactica, without a doubt.
Definitely.
It was so good, and second half of the third season notwithstanding. I think. I don't know, because I'm a bit of a political junkie, so West Wing and House of Cards, I think, are sort of must watch for anyone who takes an interest in current affairs and how the world actually works. And they are both brilliant, but unfortunately, like, these days I can't really watch either because it cuts a little too close to the bone.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know. Here's an interesting example. 70s, 80s, 90s sitcoms. Go back to where we started, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
Very formulaic, very compartmentalized. Each episode, introduction of a problem, hilarious consequences ensue, conclusion, everything's back to normal.
Yeah.
Usually shot in 4 cameras, simple, recognizable sets, very clear characters. We know who everybody is.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the 21st century, and I don't remember exactly when this actually happened, like when it started. Oh, there goes my dog. I'm sorry. I don't remember exactly when this happened. I think it was in about 2003, when Scrubs began. A sitcom that almost unprecedentedly was shot in 1 camera.
Yeah.
No laugh track. They hit some really poignant emotional points. There was a lot of drama mixed in with the laughs. And most importantly, I think there were broader arcs throughout the seasons that you would usually only get in drama series or in films, where you could tell an extended story over the course of a season. And obviously now that's been taken to its extreme with shows like True Detective and American Horror Story, etc. Yeah. Anthology shows, even things like Black Mirror, which, by the way, absolutely a high point of the last decade.
Fantastic show.
But I think that really is representative of the kind of the shift that we see, not just technologically, because we've had dollies and walk and talks for as long as cinema has been around. So it's not as if they developed something new that allowed them to do it in this format. But it was a more mature feel to it, so that we're not just escaping and hanging out and having a laugh, but we're actually living in someone's life and seeing it from their perspective. And I think that and I think that really does sort of typify the shift from a 20th century to a 21st century perspective that's the end of my sentence.
No, I think it's great. I think you're right. I'm just looking now. October 2001, Scrubs started, and I think you're totally right. looking at it, I mean, I loved Scrubs. I watched at least the first 6-7 seasons, and then I sort of trailed off a little bit. But yeah,
well, every show gets stale after a while.
Yeah, but it's.
I haven't watched The Simpsons in a decade, even though
No, I don't know who does. I don't know. It's still going on. I'm still not sure who watches that show anymore.
I don't know.
But yeah, there's. It's. I think really everything we've talked about. Really, the thing that keeps coming back to my mind about sort of 21st century. All these things, even from Scrubs, it's the fact that everything has consequences. If I get back to, you said about sort of, I'm gonna go back to the Marvel universe, but like you said, you get Iron Man, which is pretty clear cut. That Phase 1 is pretty clear cut of like good guy, bad guy. You get up to the Avengers, which is very Saturday morning TV kind of deal. It's fantastic, but then over and over and over. That sort of moment in time, what do they call it? The event or the incident, the New York fight.
Yeah.
Is there 9/11, and it had consequences that have had ramifications ongoing throughout all the TV shows, whether it be Daredevil or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or the films. There's always consequences, and it's the same with Bond. So like Casino Royale is still having consequences in the later Bond films, and so on and so forth. But if you go back to, say, other franchises pre-2000, each one was a closed loop. So Lethal Weapon 1 through 4, each one is a closed loop where they can blow stuff up, they can kill people, and it doesn't seem to impede their careers or they get prosecuted or anything.
Yep.
Or anything, the same with every Rambo film or Arnie film. They can do things.
Die Hards.
Yeah, John McClane should not be a cop by Die Hard 3. Like, he has clearly got problems beyond, whatever.
Indiana Jones.
Another one, yeah. His tenure at that Harvard University must be under question, when he's never there and always being chased by Nazi soldiers. But there's no consequences. And all of a sudden, I think that's it. There's a realisation that actually things happen and have consequences.
Yeah.
So that's the lesson.
I think you've... Yeah, I really like that. I really like that.
So, I think I've learnt a lesson. We've gone deep. We've gone deep on this, and it's been brilliant. It's been fantastic.
Yeah.
So, on that lesson, then I think we'll wrap up the conversation. And I'll say, Orie, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for spending the time with me this evening.
Thank you.
And where can people find you on the Twitters and everything else? And anything else you want to promote?
Yeah, sure. We are, again, just to remind everybody from an hour ago when we mentioned it, DragonFruit, the dating app for geeks, by geeks, absolutely free, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. And you can just search for them, or you can find links to the store pages at dragonfruitapp.com. You can follow us on Twitter at ProjDragonFruit. That's PROJ as in project. We're on Facebook at DragonFruit app and all the other social, Instagram, etc. As a side note, we have our blog on dragonfruitapp.com, which, apart from discussing the intersection between geekiness and sort of romance and relationships, we write about all kinds of things related to just geekdom in general. So it's kind of just an outlet for me quite often to sort of spout my film theory and put it somewhere for somebody to take a look at. So we work very hard on it, and we've got some really brilliant writers who are kind enough to contribute, and we've got some great artists who draw some pretty amazing things. So I would highly recommend that people check out our blog, which is at dragonfruitapp.com/blog, but there's a button on the main page, obviously.
Excellent.
And that's all of it, I think. Download it completely free. And let us know what you think, right?
Totally.
Our team is a small team. We are not many, and we are here to try to build an app that is the absolute best that it can be, and that is serving the geek community the way that it deserves to be served. So we're very available. I answer most emails personally that we get, or you can write to us through the app itself. But give us suggestions. Tell us what problems you're having. What should be different. We thrive on feedback, and if you want to see something, let us know. We'll do our best to make it happen for you. I want DragonFruit to be as user driven as is humanly possible, because I want you guys to have exactly what you want.
Brilliant. I hope they do. If you're listening, try it, have a look, and let them know. Feedback. And talking of blogs, not only are you contributing to the show today, you've written something for us as well. So you are going to be on the 20thcenturygeek.com blog as well this week.
Yeah, that's right. We'll cover some of the points that we discussed today.
Yeah.
Hopefully not too verbose.
No, it'd be great. So as soon as you're happy with that, send it over, and I shall let you know when this is going to go out.
Outstanding.
But thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And
cheers, you too.
And we'll catch up again. Thanks very much.
All right.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay, that was Orie from DragonFruit. So what a cracking conversation. I really wasn't expecting that. Didn't know how it was going to go. Wasn't really sure what the topic it was. But it's good to get outside of your comfort zone every now and then and think about these things. Hope you enjoyed it. Any feedback? Any thoughts? I'm probably going to feed this back to a couple of other geeky and nerd sites to see what their thoughts are and see if I can get some feedback. But again, echoing Orie's words, please check out DragonFruit. If you're looking for love or just looking for friends, it's a great place to start. It's on the internet. Just Google it. The apps are out there on iOS, on iPhone, the whole works. And for 20th Century Geek, thank you. If you want to get in contact with us, I'm on the Twitters at 20th Century Geek. Facebook, again, just look for 20th Century Geek. Instagram, everything else. But if you want to email me, it's 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. And check out the blog on 20thcenturygeek.com/blog, and the episodes will be out there soon. Subscribe, give me a review. 5 stars is wonderful. And I'll see you guys next week. Next week, I don't know who it will be. It depends who turns up to speak first. But we've got some crackers coming up for the summer holidays. So we've just had this, talking about the 21st century. It was rather grim, it was rather gritty, it got rather political. It was brilliant. It may not be that in-depth in the future. I'm going to be speaking to my good friend Mike, and often co-host, about the video nasties of the 70s and 80s. That may get a little political. I'm going to be talking to the lads from Super Shakes once again about 90s cartoons. Some crackers in there. I've already started Googling that one. I'm going to be talking to host of another podcast, Stacey's Parlour, about the fantastic Heroes in a Half Shell from the 90s, 80s, the Turtles. And then finally, who else? Let's think. Who else? Oh, my good friend Kim, who joined me to talk about Child's Play. She is going to be coming to join me and talking about 10 years of Tarantino. That's 1990 to 1999. 10 years of Tarantino. So, each of those people are going to be joining me on the show to talk about their favourite subjects or the subjects they've nominated. And they will also be writing a blog to accompany it. So, enjoy. This is going to be sort of the summer of love, the summer of geek. And then we're going to go on to some other things. And so, enjoy the week, and I'll speak to you soon. Thanks very much.